Good morning, and I'm moving now. I've got the registration on, and this is the presentation of Academia Bessarion, discussing today the seven acts of mercy in the context of Florence. And I am seeing Florence in a way that is different from the way she's normally seen today by academics as starting the Renaissance with the Medici, with rich patrons. Instead,
Mhm.
I'm seeing her beginnings in the Middle Ages, where she's subsuming into herself the cities of Jerusalem, Constantinople, and even with Brunetto Latino of Sevilla in Spain, who there acquires many important works which he teaches to his students, who include Dante, Guido Cavalcanti, Francesca da Barberina. And I'm seeing the basis of the city as the seven acts of mercy from the Gospel of Matthew 25, 34, 46, to feed the hungry, to give water to the thirsty, to clothe the naked, to shelter the homeless, the stranger, the pilgrim, to visit the sick, to visit the imprisoned, to ransom the captive. And the one which is not in the gospel is to bury the dead, because Christ instead said, let the dead bury the dead. Um, in my job as custodian, I do bury the dead, the ashes in the English cemetery. We needed to give a sense of Florence's history with the Ghibelline Towers of Pride initially, the gang warfare that went on between those families, feuding with vendettas, bloodshed in the streets. And then the Guelph party, instead, who were merchants, said, no, this is against the common prosperity. And they had the towers torn down, and the stones were used to build the walls of common defense by Anafa de Cambio. And it's in that milieu that Dante writes the Vita Nuova, in a sense, lamenting the loss of Jerusalem, but subsuming Jerusalem into Florence with Beatrice as Christ. And for the historical texts of this period, it's important to read Brunetto Latino's Tesoro, Dino Compagni's Chronica, Giovanni Villani's Nova Chronica, which builds on the other two. And then for our time, Robert Davidson, who's buried here, who wrote a magnificent Storia di Firenze, translated from the German, where he had studied all the documents in the archives and completely knew this period. And I found myself researching Dante's teacher from his texts. And this is also the time of the founding of the Franciscan order, which has a great deal of influence in Florence in this time. And I'm going to pass over those dates, but they are useful for us. The Misericordia begins in 1244, perhaps, and its task, it's the first organization we find, is to bury the dead, which was not in the Gospel. And the magnificent painting, which is now in the building known as the Bigalo, but which was part of the Misericordia, has the Madonna of the Misericordia with the Tower Cross on her crown, painted in red, the red blood of the Paschal Lamb, the angel of death passing over the houses that had that symbol. And the crown on the Madonna is Matilda of Tuscany's crown. And then you see the roundels of hunger and thirst, the stranger, the naked, the sick, the prisoner, God's mercy being for all, and then the men and women, and then the city of Florence. And this is the Latin text. And also on the side, you get the catechism and the sacraments. It's a teaching text. In 1961, I was in the Duomo, where at that point the Michelangelo Pietà still stood while the priest was preaching against La Dolce Vita. and I was sketching the Pietà. Michelangelo puts his own self-portrait into the face of Joseph of Arimathea as a misericordia worker with the black hood, the task being to bury the dead. And this is a photograph. I still saw the misericordia workers in these black hoods like Ku Klux Klan, who would care for the sick and the dying, and still do, but now in modern uniforms. And then I found this painting. This is of a 17th century plague in Florence, and you see the workers taking care of the sick and the dying, and it's before the modern facade. The Anafa de Cambio one has already been removed, but the new one we have today, which was partly built, paid for by Swiss bankers, is not there yet. And then these are the ambulances outside the Duomo, still functioning, free, and it's a magnificent 700-year-old heritage in Florence.
Mm.
The Ospedale di Santa Maria Nuova, founded in 1288. This is for the visiting the sick. Folco Partenare, the rich banker and founded the hospital at the insistence of Monna Tessa, who was Beatrice's nurse, and she founded the order of the Oblati, women who would take care of the cleanliness of the hospital. In 1290, Beatrice Portinari, at that point married, dies, perhaps following childbirth. And the following year is the fall of the Jerusalem kingdom, which Dante is discussing in part obliquely in the Vita Nova. In 1300, he will become prior, and in 1302, he will be in exile. This is what the hospital looked like when Martin V blessed it, and this is a reconstruction of it with the church of Sant'Egidio in the center of it. And this is the way it looked in the 17th century, and it still does today.
Mhm.
And also, though we have COVID, the testing and the masks, it's a huge complex. It takes up a large space in Florence, and it's filled with art treasures. The pottery with the T on it is the crutch, which also symbolizes the Tao. Those are pieces of fragments of china we find buried in the English cemetery. This task of creating wonderful clay, firing it with glazes, was especially carried out by the Della Robbia family. And this was made for the Ospedale degli Innocenti with the dead body of Christ on the lap of Mary. This is where Michelangelo and Leonardo studied anatomy using the corpses of the dead. And this is the painting that Tommaso Portinari, the descendant of Folco Portinari, commissioned of Hugo van der Goes in Bruges, where he was part of the banking establishment, which had this network all over Europe and also in Africa and East Asia. We have this painting created for Santa Maria Nuova, for the Church of Sant'Egidio in the center of it in 1475. Now it's no longer in situ, it's in the Uffizi. But we see the baby lying naked on the ground, and this is Jesus, and it is also us needing care by the community. And this follows on Matthew 25. When I was thirsty, did you give me drink? When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? Or San Michele is our next institution. It's built in 1289 by Anafa di Cambio, destroyed in fire in 34, rebuilt in 1336. and it was to feed the hungry. It was a great granary. It has 3 floors, huge building, amazing engineering that it was created, and it was almost destroyed at the Risorgimento. I'm so glad it was not. And right from the start, there had been this miraculous image of Mary and the child. And both the hospital and San Michele had groups that formed around them that would come together and sing the Compagnia dei Laudesi, singing Franciscan laudes, meeting together for Mass. And this is, in a sense, the glue of the city. The members of the Compagnia de Laudesi, as would others, would be buried near the Duomo in the Piazza San Giovanni. And we also have the Compagnia di Laudesi di Sant'Egidio is the one for Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. In 1289, Ugolino della Gherardesca and his children died in prison, and it was seen that he had cannibalized his children. Florence felt so awful about this because they had created this forbidden any foodstuffs going to Pisa. So the people were starving, and in their revenge, they created this punishment of Ugolino that he should starve. And when this was discovered, the Florentines, in reparations, built San Michele. And it was to feed even the enemy in time of famine, the Pisans, the Sienese, and so forth. 1296, Arnolfo di Cambio builds the Duomo. 1300, Guido Cavalcanti dies because Dante, who is prior of in the Torre del Castagna, has had to exile him because he was feuding with Corso Donati, and this was not allowed. And as a result, he dies of fever. And then Dante himself will die in 1321 after writing the Commedia. Guido Cavalcanti, before his death, had written this sonnet about San Michele, saying how wonderful it is that this lay people's construction is not by the church, is not by the Franciscans or the Dominicans or the Curia, it is by the lay guilds, and each have contributed wonderful statues, paintings, and so forth, and maintain it. And so many miracles happen around the figure of the Madonna. This photograph I took many years ago when San Michele was still very dirty, and it was marvelously holy. When they cleaned it up, it lost that sense of. But here is this splendid building, and this is the second floor. I don't have a photograph of the third, which is absolutely marvelous with a view all around Florence. And here are the figures now placed indoors with our copies outdoors of the various saints protecting Florence. And this is the book which the King of Spain, Castile, gave to Florence, to Brunetto Latino, Las Cantigas de Santa Maria, with all of the miracles of the Virgin. And in each of these pages, she's shown in the tabernacle, which is copied at San Michele. This is the previous one before the fire, from the Libro del Baiaiolo. And then you can see how beautiful it is in the Orcagna Tabernacle. And then we come to the Ospedale degli Innocenti in 1419, built by Brunelleschi. And this is not in the actual acts of mercy, but it's the caring for the orphan. Instead of killing the babies that couldn't be supported out of poverty, they could be carried to the Ospedale degli Innocenti, where they would have been raised by the Guild of the Arte delle Sete, of Silk Guild, and given, if they were a boy, a trade, a skill, and if they were a girl, a dowry. And all of this follows on from the Franciscans and the Servites. In fact, the Ospedale is right next to the Church of the Santissima Annunziata. This was the order founded by 7 rich young men who went up into a cave in the mountains of Monte Senario and had a vision of the Virgin, gave up their wealth to live the life of prayer and charity. And then in 1436, you will have Brunelleschi. This is done when he's quite young. He will finish the dome of the Duomo. And then later you will have the Council of Florence with the Greeks coming, Cardinal Bessarion bringing manuscripts. And then with the loss of Constantinople, Florence will be the main heir of that city's splendid intellectual wealth. Here is the square of the Santissima with the Ospedali and with the wonderful medallions by the Della Robbia. And this is the boys' cloister. The girls' cloister is small. I'm afraid we always get the short end of the stick. And then here is the painting by Domenico Ghirlandaio for the children in the orphanage. And you can see the 2 boys building the stable, the housing for this family who are so poor that the baby is born naked in the stable. And here you get the rich men who are giving their wealth to build this hospital. Their portraits, including the portrait of the artist, is among them. And then this view is probably of the Arno going up to Compiobi. There's this way in Florentine art of making the gospel here and now, in this moment in Florence, and collapsing time, because they are creating a new Jerusalem. And then the Buon Uomini di San Martino in 1442, which has around it painted by Domenico Ghirlandaio, again, the 7 Acts of Mercy. And again, I give you some of the dates. And here is this tiny church, probably founded by Irish monks who always founded their churches in honor of St. Martin in the Dark Ages. And it would have been Dante's church. His house is just opposite. And it describes inside, here is the vision, the story of St. Martin, who's a Roman soldier who must not give away his vestments and his sword, but who cuts with his sword his soldier's cloak in half. Cloaks are very important in the story. It can be Mary's cloak, it can be St. Martin's cloak. And then dreaming, he has the vision of Christ coming to him and saying, I was the naked beggar whom you clothed. And then you have the drink to the thirsty, you have the lodging for the pilgrims, you have clothing the naked and visiting the sick. And these are scenes in Florence at this date. And here, releasing the prisoner. You'd already had this dreadful story in Villani of Corso Donati liberating all of the prisoners, but it was to have them support him gain power, which was not really according to, you have Compagni and Villani speaking of him as a new Catiline. And here you get this wonderful detail from the caring for the pilgrims of the glasses and the pottery, which is like the pottery we find in the English cemetery. And here is a marriage with the notaio making sure that the correct dowry is paid, and also the time of the death, the inventorying of the possessions, the children are going to be looked after. And here you see the burial of the dead in the Jewish fashion with the sheet around the body laid in the naked earth. And this is also the time of Savonarola, who was surrounded by artists telling them not to paint their mistresses as the Madonna, but to find a pure young girl, and she would be more beautiful. And this is Luca della Robbia's magnificent visitation of the young, pregnant, unwed Mother Mary being greeted by the priestly, elderly, pregnant Elizabeth. It's the most beautiful sculpture in terracotta. One of the things that the Florentines were able to do was to use the cheapest materials like clay of the earth and create absolutely exquisite beauty from it. Up here is the altar frieze, the choir frieze done by Luca della Robbia. And then down here, I would like to be able to see if I can do the, no, sorry. Uh, if I could, yes. Um, right. What I want to do here is to show the angels in Paradiso are the boys that Savonarola had going around the households and collecting up all of the vanities, false hair, cosmetics, etc., false padding, and so on. Okay, now we can go on to the next one. Let's see if I can figure out how to go back. I don't know how to unmagnify. Okay, sorry. Okay, let's see if I could. Right. Uh, Next one. This is the fountain by the third generation of the Della Robbias, Giovanni Della Robbia, who used lots of color, and it's a public fountain giving drink to the thirsty. When I was a few years ago, two Roma women one day washed their hair and clothes here, and they were photographed by a journalist, and it was published in the newspaper, and all Florence was furious. How could those filthy Roma women dare go near this beautiful work of art? But actually, this work of art was created precisely for that purpose, to give drink to the thirsty, cleanliness to those who needed it. And now I'm doing a transition into Terence's presentation on the seven acts of mercy. This is the connection between Florence and Naples and Rome. This is when St. Birgitta brought together the Pope and the Emperor to create peace in Europe and against the Protestant Reformation. And here we have her daughter, Catherine of Sweden. Here is Bridget of Sweden. And here's Lapa Acciaioli Buondelmonte. She is Niccolo Acciaioli's sister. And this is the Certosa outside Florence that Niccolo Acciaioli built with his ill-gotten wealth gained from Naples and all the various colonies left behind by the Crusaders, because the king of Naples was also king of Jerusalem. Even though Jerusalem was lost, there still were quite a lot of possessions. And when Niccolo Acciaioli is dying, Birgitta has this horrendous vision saying his soul is almost lost, but the Virgin has all of these Carthusian monks of the Certosa praying for him under her cloak. And this goes right back to the Madonna della Misericordia, the painting of the Madonna della Misericordia with the Innocenti orphans, Brunellesco's dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, and also the paintings of the same theme by Simone Martini and Piero della Francesca. And now we come to Terence. Unmute. Unmute. Your microphone is muted.
There we
Thank
go.
you.
Thank you, Sister Juliet. No, I wanted to thank you for inviting me to share some words about this painting, which actually became an obsession of mine and my wife Idana's, and I ended up writing a book called The Guardian of Mercy about based on the guardian of this painting. and how this painting transformed his life. And uh, if that kind of evolution was possible, this painting is actually a perfect example of it. How art was meant to elevate the common man. And that is all part of the story. It's also translated into Italian and available in Florence at the Libreria Editrice Fiorentina. But I wanted to touch on that origin story you had of the Santissima Nunziata, because 7 young men from wealthy families in a cave have a vision. Well, in Naples, now we're flashing forward 150 years. In Naples, you have a very strange event that involves 7 young men, cadetti, so they're not going to inherit the wealth of the family. They're second or third born within the family, but they go for a picnic on the Bay of Naples. A huge tempest arrives, sweeps across the bay. They seek shelter in a cave, and instead of having a vision of the Madonna, what they understand is when the wave passes, when all of the storm passes, they're they're obsessed that perhaps it's been a sign of God, that their prayers were answered and that they were saved. And one of the young men announces, let's forego our food and our picnic. Let's take it to the one place where they need it most. And they march across the city into the hospital of the incurabili, the uncurables, where people went in vertical and they went out horizontally, if you understand what I mean. And in the hospital of the incurables, they didn't simply give food, but they found themselves comforting the sick. They found themselves shocked to learn that the dead were not given any rites for burial, but rather simply dumped into the common pit outside the city gates with no last rites, because one had to pay for last rites. Now, that led them to form an institution called the Piemonte della Misericordia. But its early days began with each of them moving in front of the churches, camouflaged, begging for money. And surely these were churches that their families had frequented. But when news got out that these young men were doing this and moved by these acts, and that they were returning to the Ospedale of the Incurabile week after week, every Friday, to perform these acts of mercy, money started to be given, and then the Pope delivered a permit, a permission to this order that was the first lay order in Naples to take care of the poor and to assume acts of charity. And in a way, it was a revolutionary effort. And they were all in their early 20s. And what should happen the minute they received this permission from the Pope? Caravaggio arrives. He arrives as a fugitive. And they had built a small chapel, which is just next to San Gennaro, the famous Duomo in Naples. And the one piece that they missed was this altar piece dedicated to the 7 acts of mercy. If we go back to that Cappella of the Buon Uomini that we saw, where each of those acts were then by Ghirlandaio described very clearly and pictorially, what Caravaggio does in this painting, which is quite remarkable, is he involves all 7 acts on this tiny little street in Naples. And if you notice, there is no cardinal, there is no wealthy patron. It is the poor helping the poor. And this is what makes it so striking. And almost every Neapolitan, if you ask which painting epitomizes your city, this is the painting that they always point to. They always refer to this. Now, the 7 acts are very difficult to separate, but I'll try and share just a few points. And what I'm doing now is doing essentially what that young guardian did to us when we entered the chapel and completely illuminated us. The figure that is the most shocking and the most revealing is Pero, this young woman you see on the right, who's lending her breast to a starving prisoner. But actually, this is rooted in classical Roman virtue, which is both the obedience of the child to the father and mother, and also this Roman act of charity, this ancient story of a young woman who, having no food herself, but having given birth, actually, and her father being wrongly imprisoned, goes to the prison and feeds him with her breast. And in fact, in this image, Caravaggio, so you have both visiting the prisoner as well as feeding the hungry, but you'll see 2 little drops of milk on the father's chin. He's so famished. Now, the story then gets played out. It's a redemption story because when the guards exit the jail and see this shocking scene, instead of her running away, they are so moved by her act of compassion that in the classical legend, the father is freed. So by her courage and showing this incredible compassion, the father will be freed. But next to her right elbow, you see these 2 men, one holding a burning torch, and this other gentleman who is who's what they typically had in Naples, a young man who is taking away the dead, and you'll see him holding 2 feet. Now those feet are not blue; they could be this person could have died very, very recently. But we don't see the face. And in fact, what Caravaggio is saying, that this could be any of us. And that light that you see glowing in the center is this almost a torch of the mandala that everything is circling around. Now, the importance of burying the dead that Sister Julia mentioned is so critical because this was actually one of the reasons why the Piemonte was formed, is to raise money to pay the priests to give last rites. And as you move across, you'll see St. Martin. He's cutting, he has that cape. You'll see that part of the cape is held in the right hand of this gentleman below, who's nude on the ground, his feet, dirty feet pointed towards us, which is, again, a Caravaggio technique to remind us of the poverty. And he's clearly cut his robe. As they said, the robe was owned by the state, but part of it was owned by the state, part of it by the individual. He has cut his part and given it to this naked man. And then as you move forward, you'll see these other figures, the pilgrim being invited into this by this bar, say, tavern keeper. You'll see Samson not simply drinking his water, giving water to the thirsty, but actually he's trying to absolve himself of the massacre that he's just conducted, where he's killed thousands of the Philistines. And in a way, he's cleansing himself of that crime. As Caravaggio, in painting all of this, is cleansing himself, begging for redemption for the murder that he's been accused of. Now, if you go up above, what's so striking about this, not one figure is aware of the tumult above them. Above them, two angels are catapulting out of the spirit world, and something very strange has happened. Look at their wings. They're actually casting shadows on the far wall. And angels do not, the spirits do not cast shadows. They are spirits. They're not in the carnal world. But simply viewing this display of these acts of mercy being conducted on the streets has rendered this moment so sacred. They've been so moved by the compassion that they've actually been pulled into the carnal world. They have been made carnal, not unlike the little boy that's above, who's just been born, to a young woman who could well be leaning out of her balcony in the Neapolitan streets, peering down below at all the tumult. And she, of course, is the Madonna. And all of this, Caravaggio paints in less than 3 months. It's a painting that's over, I'd say, 12 feet high, about 10 feet wide. It's a colossal work. But this painting has only been moved once, because when the young founders of the Piemonte saw the work, they absolutely understood that in the statutes they had to inscribe that it can never be moved. And that is why, if you want to see it, you simply must go to Naples. But here you have the Florentine tradition of the acts of mercy being transported back to Naples, to add another layer of compassion to the city, to highlight the compassion the popolo had for each other. In fact, one could argue the only way that Naples could have survived was with this compassion that's inherent in the Neapolitans. Yes, it's a tough city. Yes, there's crime. Yes, there's poverty. Yes, there was the plagues and eruptions, earthquakes, and all these crises. But rather than split the people apart, it actually pulled them together. That thread is what Caravaggio sees when he goes to Naples. One sees less of it in Rome, of course, and one sees, apart from the Misericordia in Florence, perhaps he saw less of it there. But this painting then becomes, with these 16 figures, probably the masterpiece, the little known masterpiece that Caravaggio painted, and many would argue probably his greatest work. The one thing I wanted to touch on that Sister Julia had mentioned is this notion, just to underline again, this notion that Florence is, yes, she's going to be the heir of Constantinople. Yes, she will be the new Jerusalem. But this was not an idea created by the Medicis. This was an idea embedded well before, 150 years before. So by 1300, the population of Florence is over 100,000 people. It's the richest city in Europe. It is the center of the finest textile trade in Europe, which is to say there's great importance given to the guilds that are now reaping enormous sums of money, collectively reaping sums of money. This is not about a few families with large latifundia keeping serfs, but rather enterprise, commerce, and all within the city. And a series of laws were enacted to encourage order and dignity, and to express a shared spirit of civic pride, to make the city the più bello che si può. And I think this is the piece that's so missing in the adulation that Florence receives and the adulation that Medici's receive, because it is that communal spirit that we're seeing acted out in the streets here, unwritten, undefined, but there you see it in the Caravaggio's painting. That was inscribed in the Florentine ethos. That was inscribed in the medallions that are on Giotto's tower that are in front of the Duomo, the various guilds and the importance to the city fabric. And in that was also each guild had inscribed legal, ethical behavior that was absolutely had to be followed. I use the example that my brother-in-law Giannozzo has made, where he said, if you look, you will see that the Bakers Guild, they were prescribed at 5 o'clock if people passed by and they were hungry and there was extra bread, to give that bread to the hungry. That any cheating in the carpentry guild, any cheating of the product, claiming that it was cherry wood instead of walnut, you would lose your membership to the guild. Quality and integrity was so much guarded. And within these guilds, then the idea of beautifying the external city, every single structure. When you come to Florence and you see Santa Croce, the largest Franciscan church outside of Assisi in the world, you see the great Duomo, which was Santa Reparata. You see the Bargello, Palazzo Vecchio, Santa Maria Novella. These were all built from 1250 to 1300, a good 100 years before the Medici's even surfaced. And they were built by the guilds, by the silk, by the wool guilds, all collaborating to beautify and make their city the more beautiful that she can be. But when it comes to the acts of mercy, also it is a Pratesi, a merchant, who funded what we saw in the Ospedale delle Innocenti, the Hospital of the Innocents, the an orphanage where the Silk Guild ended up managing it and being the patron. But why? Because they were protecting the most vulnerable, giving the most vulnerable orphans, these children, a palace from which to not simply live, but to leave. And in that elegance and that sense of nobility, raising this idea of evolving a society, evolving a city with a higher sense of protecting its own, caring for its own, setting up institutions that would ensure that takes place. This is, as we mentioned last night, these are all elements of collectively living together that we seem to have lost, or at least have been brought into question by cynics of the status quo that want to rip out the collective cohesion that should be in this society. The 7 acts of mercy from Matthew 25 becomes an anchor for progressives to try and eliminate as much as possible this gap between the wealthy and the poor, to try and eliminate some of the inequalities, or at least to try and sustain in a humane way, a compassionate way, these those who have suffered. And I think that's the message that underlines not simply the spirit of Florence, but in a way Naples. One could argue even Italy, where today more people work as volunteers for social causes than any other country in the world. It's in the character. So Um, this painting, one could argue, not simply represents Naples, but as Jane Joyce said when they asked him, "Why do you always write about Dublin?" And he said, "I figure that if I can get Dublin right, I'll be writing about all the cities of the world." And I'll end with simply the observation that this is um, the inspiration also of Pope Francis's declaration uh, of the year that he had the extraordinary jubilee of Misericordia. It was based on this. Caravaggio, of course, is his favorite painter, and we've had to wait 500 years for a pope to emerge that actually speaks to the poor in the way that Pope Francis has, which is exemplified by Caravaggio, which is why shortly after he died, his work went in to complete, um, uh, um, literally virtually disappeared, and he's only resurrected in 1951 by Longhi after the war. There's a retrospective, and he returns as one of the most favorite, if not the most favorite, Italian painter of history. But this message was a radical message. It cut against the status quo, and yet it is the central message, I think, that Sister Julia was saying, that founded both, that allowed for the social cohesion of Florence.
Yes, I see Florence as such a model for every city, and that this aspect of it must become known. It's been buried with the idea of the wealth of the Medici, the conniving of the misreading of Machiavelli, and so forth. On the road going from the Bargello to Piazza Beccaria, where the condemned criminals were executed, there is this tabernacle where Christ is leaning off the cross and Mary is leaning backwards towards the condemned criminal to give mercy to him, to save his soul. And Florence, on the influence of Cesare Beccaria's book on crime and punishment, which Dostoevsky copied with his title, Crime and Punishment. This book was published in 1764, arguing for the abolition of
Mm,
capital punishment, which took place in Tuscany in 1786,
mm,
the first place in the world to abolish this cruel and unusual punishment. This is a mark of the greatest civilization. And Florence continued with these acts of mercy, although this became mainly from outside influences now. Sheltering the homeless, Monte Domini was founded the time of Napoleon in 1812. And here we have an episode where they sheltered for a while a Roma family, two Roma families. And then we have Jean-Pierre Vieussieux, Swiss, and Alfred Wagner, who actually funded the facade of the Duomo. We saw it as naked, and then he clothed it with marble in the Victorian period. This is a celebration for the Swiss in Florence with the Gonfaloni of Justice, which goes right back to the Torre della Castagna. This would be brought by the Podestà to end vendettas and bloodshed. It was for justice, and it was brought to the cemetery to honor the tomb of Jean-Pierre Vieussieux with the laurel crown. And here we have Madame de Staël, who wrote Corinne ou Italy, where she was writing prophetically about unification of Italy. This is the young daughter of an artist herself, a great artist, Louise Kunis, her self-portrait in the Uffizi, but she dies of puerperal fever because they didn't wash their hands when delivering her baby. And then this is the great Swiss painting, which unfortunately was Hitler's favorite painting, The Island of the Dead, about this cemetery here. And this cemetery, in a sense, is one of the acts of mercy because we have restored it with the Roma who have built the library shelves. Here, the young couple are building the cradle for their baby who would be born the next day. Here, they're learning how to chisel letters on marble. And one of them has made Frederick Douglass, ex-American slave, came here 11th of May 1887. Many of our burials here are people who worked against slavery, the abolition not of capital punishment but of slavery. And the Roma themselves were slaves longer than were blacks in America from the Middle Ages until the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in Romanian. And this is what they've achieved with planting Florence's lily, which is on uh, the
Mhm.
gonfalone of justice. And then another episode is of the Sicilian Giorgio Lapira, who was professor of Roman law at the University of Florence, who became mayor, who saw Florence like Savonarola as a New Jerusalem. And his great friend and supporter, Fioretta Mazzei, to whom I promised that I would do everything I could in my power to help Florence. And then we are helped, our Roma project, by the Progetto Agata Smeralda. That was the name of the first child abandoned at the Ospedale degli Innocenti. And Professor Mauro Bassi raises funds caring for the orphan. I said to him it would be better to keep the children with their parents instead of putting them in orphanages. And he agreed, and we work with Roma families. So thank you, Danuta Shanza and Terence Ward, for this. And we can continue discussing, if we'd like, these aspects which are the other side of the coin from the Renaissance of the Medici. It is Florence's medieval and sense, also its Republican sense that goes all the way through Savonarola to Giorgio Lapira, which we would like to see revived today, where it is for the dignity of man,
Mm.
but it's the dignity of all men with justice, which is fairness for all. Terence, can you add something to this?
Well, I think you've opened up a very interesting chapter of, uh, say, of redefining the city, of helping all of us look at the origins, the fabric that was woven, that cohesion, that collective cohesion that was woven into the city, precisely to avoid the, as you said, those towers of pride and these unbelievable bloody vendettas that were spilling blood across the streets. I mean, what the merchant and the guilds were able to do, and a guild, of course, means that you belong to a larger organization, you have allegiance to that, and then, of course, to the city itself. That created a collective sense and a collective spirit that bound um, even those who were involved in the banking families to those who were the less fortunate. There was a completely different experiment that took place in the Florentine Republic under the first Popolo that didn't exist anywhere in Europe. And the revolutionary aspect of that had such a pull that even it's argued that the early fascination with American writers of Florence wasn't really through the Medici lens, but it was this Republican aspect, this new bold direction of speaking about um, the aspirations of a people as opposed to a few families. So much so that when you look at the so-called Declaration of Independence, and it's said that the word, this pursuit of happiness that's been interpreted, I think, by many conservatives to mean whatever you can make for yourself, as long as you're happy, you don't have to give a care about a single other person. It's all about self-greed and all of that. Actually, it's rooted, Jefferson used the Greek word, which actually means harmony. It was translated as happiness, but just imagine the revolution that would have happened if it was the pursuit of harmony. And if it had been, it simply translated that way instead of the word happiness, then abiding by that harmony means working with each other, finding consensus, trying to build a society. Now, the Florentines also were clever enough in this new revolutionary government to understand that power could not be held by politicians indefinitely, like what we're seeing now with these last hours of President Trump. Uh, a gonfaloniere of justice to decide to avoid these vendettas, but to decide the just uh, uh, um, verdict for a particular offense, only served 2 months. Now, in 2 months, how much corruption can take place from one man's ego, one man's vanity? Very little. And that in and of itself allowed for a continuum. Knowing you were going to be rotated out, you actually were trying to keep the administration moving forward to benefit the larger whole and not your own self-interest that we've seen for the last 4 years exhibited through the American president filling his hotels, etc. That behavior was conditioned by the intelligent manner of the popolo to say the primo popolo, the construct of the original Florentine Republic. 2 months is all you have. Now, if we want to understand how Florence becomes who she is, it's that political revolution that takes place. It's this embedded sense of the acts of mercy. And it's also the Madonna, that just to underscore the Madonna, as opposed to the Holy Trinity, that, of course, the masculine Trinity that is very much held by Rome, the Madonna becomes the image of the city. This is the only city that has the Madonna virtually almost as a birthright. Santissima Annunziata, the painting there of the Madonna, is the most sacred painting in Florence, 1250, by this Frau Bartolomeo. And that fresco on the back wall of Santissima Annunziata, the only place in the, I think, in Christendom that you will see all half of the pews turned towards her and her tabernacle, with their backs to the actual altar. I mean, it's a radical proposition, but all to say, she represents the city. It's not simply a fertility cult, it's all of us. The young girl in that painting could have been a girl passing by in Frau Bartolomeo in the street. The Madonna is within all of us. And it's, again, to underline what you said, Sister Julia, that image of the Madonna of Misericordia painted in 1342 in the Bigallo, grazie, Frank. That image becomes the model of the cupola. The cupola is terracotta. Whoever saw a cupola in terracotta? You don't see cupolas in terracotta. That was to have the same coloring of the cape of the Madonna in the painting. As if to say, we are all under her cloak. And as I mentioned last night, that the many Florentines will say, if they were born close to the Duomo, they say, I was born under her shadow, meaning under her cloak. This is something that people say today because they don't symbolically, a Florentine in that period, and some today, look at that cupola and they don't see a structure, they see the Madonna of the Begallo that has now over the city. So this city also has this deep feminine compassion that has been integrated and interwoven. I would say in the public works and the public institutions that are here, held by the Misericordia, and it is the Madonna that is the symbol of that Misericordia, the Madonna of mercy. And there, again, to underline, Florence is the heart of the Marian cult of the world. The Marian cult, the cult, or at least the devotion to the Madonna and to Mary, begins here and is embedded here. No other city has this kind of reverence. And I think that also helps us to understand this obsession with beauty, this obsession with beautifying the city as your own home, the home of the Madonna. I think it all that motherly sense and the respect and devotion to the mother is something that is deeply embedded. And of course, what do mothers do? Acts of mercy are come naturally to men, less so, but to women, it's second nature. So we see all of this crossing these threads, crossing over, and has nothing to do with the Medici's. This was something interwoven centuries before, and I want to thank you, Sister Julia, for pointing this out.
I would like to add, from the English perspective,
Hmm.
my Anglican mother foundress, who founded our order in the 19th century, very much influenced by Ruskin and Rossetti and
Hmm.
Morris and so forth. She actually founded us in Red Lion Square, where the Pre Raphaelite movement began.
Yeah,
And she would send the nuns who were going to be teaching in India by way of Florence so that they would study Florentine culture,
really.
because she'd written into her rule that a sin against beauty is a sin against the Holy Ghost, which
Yeah.
I love. And she dreamed up the idea of our Anglican community of the Holy Family sitting in an olive tree up near Settignano. So the setting was, and she, instead of obeying her brother who said she should buy a purpose built school, she bought the home of Augustus Hare, who was a Victorian travel writer who wrote a wonderful book about Florence. And he had William Morris wallpaper, he had Della Robbier's, he had an Italian Renaissance terrace in the garden, and so forth. So we grew up as children in the midst of Italian beauty.
Mm.
And that's what's brought me back to this city, also studying Dante. But at the same time, we've been talking about silk and the great wealth that the silk industry created in Florence with mulberry trees and so forth, and silkworms. Even the Grand Duke Leopold was insisting that all farms had 6 mulberry trees. There were 6 mulberry trees here in this cemetery from that ruling. But also wool was important for Florence,
Yeah,
the Arte della Lana, and that is the
yeah,
English connection because we were the
yeah,
producers of wool. And
yes.
my great grandfather was a very poor boy who was taught by Patrick Bronte in Haworth, walked barefoot across the moors at 11 years old when the age for working was 12, to
Mm.
work in the mills of Bradford, became manager at 18, taught himself fluent Russian,
Mm.
um, bought Saltaire, which was a model mill town in the countryside with a canal, a river, and a railroad, and stone houses for all the workers.
mm,
And it's a beautiful town. And
mm,
my great grandfather, who was made baronet for this, doubled it in size in the Italian architecture which he saw in St. Petersburg. So I see Florence as the leaven in the lump, that we have something here which
mm,
is so precious globally, and that we, in a sense, are the university, the academy of the
mm.
world. And it's not for the elite, it is for everyone, which is
Yes.
what
Mm,
we have with John Ruskin and his
mm,
Guild of St. George. He
mm,
was against class structuring and snobbishness, feeling that you needed to teach beauty to the factory hands and so on. And
mm,
he founded the Guild of St. George based on Florentine guilds and medieval English ones. And
mm,
I'm a companion of the Guild of St. George, uh, living his ideals of craftsmanship,
mm,
fair wages for those who work,
mm,
and the sense of the importance of beauty.
mm,
He was sketching here in Florence, in Pisa, in Venice, and England has a great love affair with Italy, especially
mm,
with Florence,
mhm,
because of the beauty which is created by the ethical structure.
mhm,
You don't create beauty out of selfishness and greed. That
mm,
doesn't work.
mm,
It ends like being Trump Tower and what he did to the Oval Office and too much gold. Instead, the Florentine style, unlike Caravaggio, is
mm,
very restrained. It's quite Protestant in its own right, puritanical, almost like the Quakers. But it is about beauty and justice.
mm,
And I think if we can rediscover that, we
mm,
can do a lot of healing of the whole world.
mm. Yes.
And interrompe condivisione, let's see. And thank you so much. And I hope it's I would like also to see if we can do this in Italian, perhaps with Idana.